I wanted to start off with giving, I'm going to use the paintings of a famous painter, a romantic painter from the 19th century named Thomas Cole. He painted this famous series of paintings called The Voyage of Life. And I thought it would be actually a helpful analogy for describing the large chunks of time. The last class, someone asked a question about how we would divide up kind of history into how humanity thought about the world, a kind of history of philosophy, maybe. And I thought these paintings actually did a good job of just giving you a visual representation of that. So Thomas Cole wasn't intending these paintings to be what I'm using them to be, but it just works. So, all right, so this is called Childhood. Childhood, here you can see, put this in my pocket so I can walk around. So here, there's a little baby down here, and this is the boat on the voyage of life, and the child is guided by an angel. And the river represents his life and time, and you can see it's kind of Edenic, all of this imagery of paradise there, and that's how life begins. And then life goes on to adolescence and boyhood, and this is kind of the ideal of as you grow up, you have dreams off in the sky, aspirations for incredible things, and you're flowering into manhood, and life is full of these incredible things that you can do. But you'll notice that here the young man leaves the angel behind him, and he's fixated on his ambitions, his dreams up in the sky, and he intends to take off that way. And so his hand now is on the tiller of the boat, whereas previously in childhood, the angel was the one who directed the course of the boat as they went on the journey. So now the man is steering the course, headed to this river towards where he thinks his dreams are, but what we can see that the young man isn't paying attention to is that the river actually takes a bend and is going to go to the exact opposite direction, which leads us to the painting called Manhood. And here now the angel's no longer in the boat at all. The man doesn't even have a hand on the tiller because there is no tiller. You'll notice that the entire handle is gone. And so all he has is just he's praying. And the angel stands back above. The angel hasn't left him, but is watching down on him from above. But I don't know if you can see it very well with the lighting here, but there's also these kind of ghoulish fiends haunting him over the sky, and he's about to plunge into this kind of destruction of rocks and chaos. Okay, so there's a fourth painting, but we'll look at that at the very end. So Thomas Cole was painting these to try to give you this kind of imaginative representation of what it's like to grow up, the purity and innocence of being a child, to the idealism of youth, to the hardships of manhood. I want to use this to divide up the history of philosophy. And I hope this will be kind of like a good visual representation of that. The image of youthfulness, I think, is a good representation of classical man, pre-modernism. So this is, just if we're looking at a timestamp, we'll say that like basically everything before the year 1600. You could maybe argue before the Protestant Reformation, 1517, but I'm just going to draw the line at 1600 for simplicity's sake. So this is before the Enlightenment, before the Industrial Revolution, anything like that. And this is where mankind lived in an enchanted world. And that is to say that mankind lived in a world where it was not possible for you to not believe in God. You just looked around at the world around you, and there was so much phenomena that you could not explain that you relied on religious explanations from most of the world. Where did that flash of lightning come from? Well, the gods are angry. And actually, I think the image of you in a boat is a wonderful picture. So I think pre-modern man was like a man who is on a boat, and he's at the mercy and the power of forces he does not control. He's guided by the stars that he looks on above. Heaven above is what he relies upon. But the winds and the current, He's just at the mercy of those things, and his job in life is to try to align himself with that reality so that he can arrive at his destination. But he's in this big, wide world. Maybe there's dragons out there. He doesn't know. And the world is populated with fairies and nymphs and gods and demons or whatever that is. And it's an enchanted world. That's pre-modern man. Pre-modern man is replaced by modern man, modernity. So beginning with the Enlightenment, and what's sometimes called the scientific revolution, rather than inhabiting this kind of mystical, magical world that is enchanted, mankind begins to inhabit a world that can be studied, a world that can be analyzed, and a world that can be, eventually, explained. And with the advent of this kind of scientific inquiry, we get this explosive rise in technology. And so now, rather than man being at the mercy of forces guiding him, which he must submit to, he now is capable of guiding himself. So if pre-modern man was on a sailboat at the mercy of the winds and currents, modern man has a steamboat. He has the ability with his own power, he can push against the forces and currents of the world to chase after his dreams and ideals. And so modernity, with the mark of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and then the Industrial Revolution, it kind of created this remarkable surge of optimism among humanity. And that's what really marked the 19th century in particular, which is when Thomas Cole was painting these, was marked by just this remarkable optimism about the future of mankind and the future of the world. Which seems silly to us because we live on the other side of the 20th century, which was the century full of more calamitous wars than any other century has ever seen. More people died in the 20th century than all previous 19 centuries combined in the wars, just the wars that were fought in the 20th century. But as we went into the 20th century, and we had even as we went into World War I, people referred to World War I, the Great War, as the war to end all wars. Because mankind, again, they're so optimistic about the future and the world and what science and our technology could do, we assumed that this war, after we vanquished these kind of hooligans out there, there would be no more wars at all. We would get the last little bit of this out of our system and we'd be taken care of. And of course, that did not happen. Modernity promised an ideal, a castle in the sky, and it didn't deliver. And so that's what gave rise to what's called post-modernity. Starting really in the 60s in earnest, post-modernity was the Western world's attempt to reconcile everything that modernity promised us. Through science and knowledge and enlightenment, we would arrive at this perfect world, and we did not. We destroyed the world. We destroyed the world in ways that we didn't even imagine. The technology that we thought was going to create Eden created hell on earth. And so particularly in France, which is where the consequences of World War II were really, really heavily seen. The French country was just ripped apart. In France, existentialist philosophers began kind of trying to question, what is this world, and who am I? If the pre-modern world, if the question was, who is God? We live in this world and it's so obviously created, designed. There are powers above me, sacred and terrifying powers. Like the question that you're asking yourself in the pre-modern world is, who is God? The question that you're asking yourself in the modern world is, what is God? You're a scientist, and through logic and reason and empirical study, you're curious about what actually is there. But in the postmodern world, you're not asking who is God. and you're not asking what is God, because the ghouls are all that you see. There's nothing good above you. There's only bad things. And so the question that all you know, your world has been reduced down only to yourself. And so the question you're asking yourself is, what is man? Or who am I? And so now we stand as the inheritors of that tradition. And you didn't probably spend your life reading the history of philosophy, and that is why you have the assumptions and ideas that you have. Of course not. But we inhabit a culture which exists as it has been passed down this stream. And so the assumptions that we have, which are given to us through the media and art and music that we consume, it passes all of this along with us. We can't go back to pre-modernism. We can't live like the steam engine or the combustion engine or the nuclear reactor doesn't exist anymore. Right? You all have probably like a fairly high degree of confidence that most mysteries in the world will probably be found out. Right? Oh, the knowledge and information and technology we have, it's just breathtaking, isn't it? So we can't act like that's not true. Right? You can't see lightning flash across the sky and wonder like, ooh, was that Zeus? Like, you know why lightning flashes across the sky. You can give a scientific explanation for it. So what do? C.S. Lewis, in writing The Abolition of Man, he's writing in 1943 in the middle of World War II, and because Lewis is a prophet, he sees what's happening to our culture and the trajectory that it's on. And he sees that what modernity promised, this through rationality and science, we will be able to explain what is. He saw that was careening towards postmodernity, where we don't know where anything is anymore. And he's writing The Abolition of Man to warn about that and trying to, as best as we can, recover the virtue and goodness of the pre-modern world, even as we exist in this postmodern one. And so he's trying to take three categories of individuals. First, he begins with the debunker. The debunker was who we met in the first chapter, and that's the authors of the Green Book, Gaius and Titius, who are here to try to show you that all of your moral values about courage and justice and goodness and beauty, they want to debunk that. What you think beauty and the sublime is really just the epiphenomena of your psychology. It's your feelings. It's that's all it is. There is no such thing as justice, like a heavenly ideal. Just what you feel about stuff. The innovator is the person who, after you debunk, let's say you go around and you debunk all of the moral claims, all of the virtues that Western society has been built on, and you debunk that and say courage, heroism, like those were given to us by evolution or rationality. The innovator is the person who's then trying to create a new moral system without appealing to that kind of heavenly virtue ideal. And then eventually, in the last chapter, which we'll begin in our next study, we'll get to the conditioner. And the conditioner is the person who, upon realizing that no moral system can be created without reference to what Lewis calls the Tao, he will simply be content to become a dictator to control and manipulate society as he sees fit. I forgot. I wrote all this down. Okay. Well, here. Okay. The debunker is the man who sees through values for what they really are, whereas traditional man believed that honor, courage, and justice were real things, what Lewis calls the Tao. The debunker believes that they are mere words used to describe subjective feelings and thus are not true. The innovator is the man seeking to ground his morality outside without reference to the Tao. So he appeals to rationality. if you sacrifice yourself, then society will be saved. He's saying like that's logical. You know, if a bomb threat is called on our church, and if we know that one of us throws themselves on the bomb so that all of us won't die, that seems like a rational idea. Without saying that, you know, like, hey, God in heaven has taught us that sacrifice is a virtue. Right? The innovator is saying, okay, we don't have to appeal to God. You can just say, doesn't it make sense that it's better for one person to die than all of us? Or the innovator will appeal to biology. We just have an instinctive urge called the herd instinct to preserve our own species. You know, mothers just have an instinct to protect their children, and we kind of have a similar instinct for each other to protect. That was what we covered in the last lecture. This is what the innovator is trying to do. Say you can appeal to rationality or biology to ground your moral ethic, your sense of why we ought to do something. But Lewis's reply is really simple. You cannot derive an ought from an is. So you cannot go from, it is rational to sacrifice yourself to preserve society, to you ought to sacrifice yourself to preserve society. So if the bomb threat is called in, and let's say we are all just cold logicians in this room, no reference to the Tao, no reference to anything above ourselves, and we just say, it is reasonable for one of us to die. We all might say, true. Who's going to be the guy? You see, stating that it is rational does not compel you to, why should you be the one to die? You can't get an ought from an is. Similarly, you have a herd instinct, but you also have lots of other instincts, like an instinct for self-preservation. So why ought you obey your herd instinct over your instinct for self-preservation? You can't get an ought from an is. The bomb comes in here, maybe you do have an instinct to, it would be good for me to, it's not rational. It's visceral. It's in my guts. I just feel like, we should protect everyone else. But you know what else is in my guts? I don't want to die. Okay, why should I stamp that instinct down and listen to that more, sacrificial instinct? You see, the only way you can go from an is to an ought is in the Tao. Okay, let's refresh ourselves. What's the Tao? The Tao is the acknowledgement that there is a higher order of value, truth, goodness, beauty, that all mankind is aware of. Everyone is aware of. It is contained in our religions, traditions, and philosophies, but it cannot be proven through empirical or logical proofs. It is just simply self-evident. It is intuitively clear to you that it is right to do certain things and wrong to do other things. And you cannot defend that. You cannot provide proofs for it. For instance, if someone were to ask you, why ought we care for victims of injustice? Or why ought we strive to care or to create a better world for the next generation? Why ought we strive to create a society that treats all people with respect? Try to justify that. And you'll realize that you're just making just raw assertions. It's better to have a society that that has an ethic of respect and fairness and equality. And if someone said, prove it to me why it's better, what do you say? You're going to reach a point where you're just going to say, it just is. Like goodness, truth, justice, beauty, those simply are self-evidently true. And Lewis appeals to the fact that even the Green Book, the claims of the Green Book, which is trying to actually undermine the Tao, it is telling you that you ought to adopt its worldview over the worldview of traditional man. To do that, it is actually relying on the Tao itself to make the moral claim. The debunker who says, it's silly for you to believe the Tao, you ought not do it. He is using the Tao itself to attack the Tao. Does that idea make sense? So that's one of the reasons why, like, you know, it feels pretty, because we are where we are in that stream of time. We're on the other side of the Enlightenment, and we are so used to claims needing proof. You know, prove it to me. We're so used to that. It feels a little scary to just say, like, it just is. Justice is just a good thing. It exists. You ought to be a just person. And when someone says, prove it to you, it's like, I don't know how to. But one of the points that we can say, maybe we can't prove, like, with rationality or empirical data that the Tao is a thing, but we don't know how to make sense of life apart from it. So even the person who is criticizing, you know, don't tell me how to live my life. As soon as I tell you to not tell me how to live my life, I am using the rule that I'm criticizing. You see, it cuts the branch off. It doesn't work anymore. So here.
I'm not sure I understand that, because the Green Book was trying to say you're relying on a set of rules that have no basis in reality. It's just a made-up set of rules. And that Green Book is just saying that set of rules is invalid. It's not saying I'm relying on that invalidity to say mine's better. It's just saying you ought not to accept that one.
But as soon as you say you ought not to accept that one, you're saying...
Because it's invalid. It's like me saying 2 plus 2 is 5, and I say you ought not to say 2 plus 2 is 5.
Right, but 2 plus 2 is 5 is, you can use logic to prove that that's false. And that's the perspective of the Green Book is logical positivism, which says the only statements that have truth value are statements that are empirically verifiable, like what temperature does water boil at, or something that is logically necessarily true, like 2 and 2 makes 4. And they're saying that any statement beyond those statements do not carry truth value. So I can talk about science, I can talk about things that are logically true, you know, syllogisms that are necessarily true. But as soon as I move outside of those realms and I say something like, it is better to be a person who tells the truth rather than tell lies, I've left the realm of both of those, and I'm now speaking in the realm of values and morals. And the Green Book is saying all speech in the realm of values and morals is meaningless speech. All you're hearing when someone speaks that way is about the emotional, subjective feelings of the speaker. But Lewis's point is that very zeal that the authors of the Green Book have to persuade you that you ought not be tricked by morals and values and tradition. He's saying that is itself relying on the Tao. They are just as moral as the priests that they're criticizing. They're saying, you don't be tricked by lies. You know, you could tinker their language into something like, don't succumb to false doctrine, believe true doctrine.
Yeah, I guess I get the feeling it's more of they're saying there is a truth, but they're not saying what that truth is. They're just saying that that's a fake, that's an illusory truth.
But the criticism that saying that something is false or fake is a moral.
Yeah, that's okay. Carry on.
Here's Lewis, the thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law, or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system in its place is self-contradictory. And so this is an important distinction. Lewis is not, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute, what Lewis is calling the Tao is not necessarily explicitly Christian morality. The Tao is simply the very framework of believing in morality itself, that there is the category of true and false, right and wrong, good and bad. And so other traditions have called it other things. And here he uses the term natural law. And that's what I want to kind of latch onto, because as Christians, we understand that this Tao, which Lewis calls, the Christian tradition calls that natural law. And it's this idea that we have an intuitive knowledge of God's existence and of God's moral framework. So that comes from the book of Romans. Romans tells us that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. See the emphasis on clarity there. The reason that every human being does not worship God intuitively is not that they lack knowledge. It is that they willfully choose to suppress that knowledge. They do not want to admit it. So that is another stream of argument that we could go into, but all I want to draw your attention to is just the prevalence of it. This is where natural law comes from, is the fact that when God makes humans in his image, he grants to them capacities for knowledge that they can walk into the world, see what God has made, and they immediately know. God's divine nature and his eternal power are clearly shown to them. They know that. But not only that, not only is there knowledge that comes from the experience of the external world around them, but Paul goes on in Romans 2 when he speaks about Gentiles who do not have the law. So that these are non-Jews who do not have the Old Testament. They are a law to themselves. When they, by nature, that's an important word, by nature, do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. So mankind does not only have a knowledge that God exists as creator through looking at the created world, he also has a knowledge that God exists as his moral judge, as he reflects inwardly on his own conscience. We have this, if you don't have the Bible, you still have a sense that there's a way you ought to live. We've never, no discoverer has ever met an amoral society. Every tribe, every people group has a system of laws, an ethic, a right and a wrong.
Can you clarify one thing?
Mm-hmm.
Instinct is what the evolutionists use
Mm-hmm.
to explain why someone would throw themselves on a bomb. This sounds like instinct.
Certainly, yeah. And Lewis he's not saying that herd instinct doesn't exist.
Well, I feel like it doesn't. I feel like this is what exists. It's the fingerprint of God and the being made
Right.
in his image. I feel like that whole biologist... Were you going to say something?
I think they made the point that instinct is just as ephemeral and unknowable as...
Exactly.
It's a word you made up to describe...
I feel that they made it up to describe this.
Well, it might be, totally. I don't know enough, honestly, about evolutionary psychology.
It sounds like they're talking about this.
Yeah, earlier in the book, he does say instinct is just a word for we know not what. When we say birds fly south by instinct, what we really mean is we don't know why they do that. They just do it. Instinct is just a term we use to explain inexplicable urges that are to guide us. I feel an instinct. I have a gut feeling, So God's knowledge is imparted to us, what this is saying, through our conscience. And our conscience is kind of our internal hall monitor, which is telling us, here's what you ought to do and ought not to do. Lewis's point about instinct is, he's just saying, okay, maybe a lot of our moral impulses, let's just for argument's sake, let's say a lot of our moral impulses come from the herd instinct. Sure. But what is it? What's What's the third thing which stands above your instinct for self-preservation and your herd instinct, and it tells you you ought to do this one? That's the conscience. That's what, that's the thing inside of you that says you should follow this impulse, not that one. That's natural law.
Okay.
So to rebel, Lewis says, against the Tao is self-suicide. The rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. If the rebels could succeed, they would find that they had destroyed themselves. The human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary color, or indeed of creating a new sun and a new sky for it to move in. The law that is written on our hearts is everywhere. And so for you to cut that out is to cut out your chest, to make you an unman, a non-person. Lewis is saying if you have any kind of moral impulse or intuition, you must submit to this natural law. And to try to step outside of it is just simply impossible. But that statement should present in your mind and in my mind a problem. We have different particular morals than people of different cultures and religions and philosophies, right? Your non-Christian friends, who Lewis would say they are just as dependent on the Tao as you are, they probably have a little bit of a different moral compass than you do, right? All right, so what do you say to that? Lewis anticipates this. Does this mean then that no progress in our perceptions of value can ever take place? That we are bound down forever to an unchanging code given once for all? And is it, in any event, possible to talk of obeying what I call the Tao? If we lump together, as I have done, the traditional moralities of East and West, the Christian, the pagan, and the Jew, shall we not find many contradictions and some absurdities? I admit all this. If you have a copy of The Abolition of Man, he has an appendix at the back where he takes different moral teachings across different religions and different philosophies, and he's trying to show you that there's far more similarities than differences, and that's true. That is true. Yet there are significant differences, and the differences matter a lot. But Lewis's argument here doesn't depend on that. So he's going to explain. He recognizes that there are contradictions across moral frameworks, and that's not a problem for him. Here's the reason why. He says there is a difference between a real moral advance and a mere innovation. From the Confucian, do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you, to the Christian, do as you would be done by, is a real advance. Anyone who accepted the old, sometimes that's called the silver rule, do not do to others what you have them not do to you. As you go from the silver to the golden rule, which is much more demanding, do to others what you would have them do to you. Anyone who accepted the silver rule would at once recognize the new as an extension of the same principle. So this is he's trying to say, if you're in the Tao, natural law, God's law, which is he's revealing his moral character to all people. Different religions and traditions and philosophies we're all going to have imprecise, imperfect apprehensions of it. Because we're made in the image of God, but we're also sinners, which means that our vision's clouded by sin. Right? So that's why maybe you have a neighbor who just burns with zeal for something that you think is like, that's kind of, I guess that's important, but I don't know if recycling is the moral issue of our day, But okay, you do see why, if you were to talk with them and they say well, we should care for our environment, we should care for the planet. We only have one planet. And what's the world our children are going to grow up in? It's actually, okay, that's not crazy. And in fact, doesn't that seem like an extension of do to others as you would have them do to you? Sure. Like, I like going to a park that's not full of trash. I should do that too. Cool. But that doesn't mean that my non-Christian neighbors, the way that they hold that up as like, that's the end-all be-all of all morality, that doesn't mean that they're correct. Like, we all have this kind of imprecise apprehension of what the moral law teaches, and this is why Lewis he's limiting himself at this entire lecture to, he's trying not to speak explicitly like a Christian. So he's limiting himself, but we don't have to do that here. What we all need is we need more than theologians. Theologians refer to natural law as general revelation. We need more than that. We need special revelation. And that's the revelation that's revealed in God's Word, and particularly in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is referred to in the book of Colossians as the image of the invisible God. And so he is the perfect clarifying lens for what God is like. And God's Word is the perfect distillation of what the Tao is, what that natural law is, which all these different religions and traditions have foggy, fuzzy apprehensions of. Does that make sense? Now Lewis is saying, so there's a difference between going from the silver to the golden rule. That's a real moral advance. And anyone who would understand the silver rule, they would see that the golden rule is right in step with the spirit of the Tao. Just like for you, maybe recycling isn't the end-all be-all, but as soon as someone explains the reasoning, it actually does make sense. That does align with the Christian ethic of love of neighbor, right? That actually makes a lot of sense. That's different than an innovation. Which, here, let's see. Those who understand the spirit of the Tao and who have been led by that spirit can modify it in directions which that spirit itself demands. So if you accept the silver rule and you hear the golden rule, you realize that is actually in line. Only they can know what those directions are, but the outsider knows nothing about the matter. Who's the outsider? It's the person who is trying to live outside of the Tao. That is the innovator. And here's his example. The morality of Nietzsche is a mere innovation. All right, so now we got to deal with that. Okay, who's this guy? Mustache enthusiast, Friedrich Nietzsche. It's pretty impressive. It really is. Okay, Friedrich Nietzsche was a Prussian philosopher. He was actually the son of a Lutheran minister, and he was going to go into the ministry before he went crazy. And Nietzsche is the original postmodern. He's in the 1800s, so he's way ahead of his time. But he's the first person who is willing to kind of poke the holes in modernity. Modernity had this overinflated confidence in the human capacity, in the overconfidence in our knowledge and our ability to master everything. Nietzsche knew how flawed men were. He knew how beset with prejudices and suspicions, how subjective and fickle we were, and how beholden we were by our desires and our passions. But rather than criticizing it like Christ and following the path, he just jumped off the cliff instead and said, we're all beholden to our lusts and our passions. I'm just not going to be embarrassed about that anymore, and I'm just going to say that. I just do what I want to do because I'm a selfish person. Here's a tight summary of Nietzsche's worldview that I think goes head-to-head exactly with what Lewis is talking about. In his book, Beyond Good and Evil, he says, one loves ultimately one's desires, not the things desired. One loves ultimately one's desires, not the thing desired. So think about when Gaius and Titius say about Coleridge's comment about the waterfall, that the waterfall was sublime. And Gaius and Titius say, you think he's saying something about the waterfall, but really he's just telling you about his own feelings. I feel sublime. Nietzsche just says, Yeah, that's true. Like when a man says, I love a woman, he doesn't actually love the woman. But there's something that he desires. Like it's more about him than about the person out there. Because all I have are my desires. All I have are I'm just a fountain of lusts and desires and urges, and that's who I am. That's what Nietzsche said. And the fact that you're trying to throttle those because of some Christian ethic, you're just not living, man.
So you could rephrase that. One lust they don't love in the true definition of it.
Dude, grow your mustache out a little bit more, Keith. You got it. Okay, here's a fuller quote from his book, Twilight of the Idols. My demand upon the philosopher is known, that he take his stand beyond good and evil, and leave the illusion of moral judgment beneath himself. This demand follows from an insight which I was the first to formulate. Nietzsche is mega arrogant. That there are altogether no moral facts. Moral judgments agree with religious ones in believing in realities which are no realities. Morality is merely an interpretation of certain phenomena, more precisely, a misinterpretation. Moral judgments, like religious ones, belong to a stage of ignorance at which the very concept of the real and the distinction between what is real and imaginary are still lacking. Thus, truth at this stage designates all sorts of things which we today call imaginings, or Gaius Anticius would say, feelings. Moral judgments are therefore never to be taken literally. So understood, they always contain mere absurdity. So that's the Nietzschean ethic. There are no moral facts. You know, if your neighbor says recycling is the way that we should live our life, that's the pressing moral issue, and maybe you think, I think sexual morality is really the pressing cultural issue of the day. Nietzsche thinks you're both wrong. There is no morality. Like, you've been tricked. You know, you're beholden to a traditional Christian religious one. Your neighbor is just beholden to a kind of progressive secular one. But both of you you haven't moved beyond good and evil yet. You haven't realized that all of your actions, all of your decisions have no moral value. You're not a good person, you're not a bad person, you're just a person with urges and desires and longings. And the most human thing you can do is follow those urges and desires. That's Nietzsche. He's a consistent man. I mean, and eventually he goes crazy.
But he's making a claim.
Exactly. That's exactly. And that's Lewis's criticism to him is,
Wouldn't
yeah.
want to have two Nietzsches in the same room. They'd be at war.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Okay. The Nietzschean ethic can be accepted. So this is Lewis, back to Lewis now. The Nietzschean ethic can be accepted only if we are ready to scrap traditional morals as a mere error, and then to put ourselves in a position where we can find no ground for any value judgment at all. It is the difference between a man who says to us, you like your vegetables moderately fresh? Why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh? And a man who says, throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead. So you like your vegetables moderately fresh, why not try to grow them yourself? That's Lewis's example of, you see, the Tao can be modified. You can go from the silver rule, you know, your neighbor who's like, yeah, recycling is really important because we should care for the earth. True, that's good. You know what else you should care about? God. Right? You're within that framework of moral judgments, of going from good to better. Nietzsche is stepping outside of that entirely. He's saying, eat bricks and centipedes. And of course, you're saying, what? I don't know how to live that way. His attempts at alteration, as we have seen, contradict themselves. Who said that? Julie, you brought that up. Yeah. See, Lewis is being, he's like, he's trying to alter the moral framework even with his crazy stuff. It is a contradiction because he's insisting on you adopt his worldview. But so far from being able to harmonize discrepancies in its letter by penetration to its spirit, that's how the person who's modifying their moral framework, right? Like they're growing. Instead, this innovator merely snatches at some one precept on which the accidents of time and place happen to have riveted his attention, and then he rides it to death for no reason that he can give. Like if you pulled Nietzsche aside and you say, hey, why is it so important that we should live? If you read Nietzsche, he hates Christianity because he thinks Christians are hypocrites, because they claim to be constrained by virtue and mercy and charity, but he thinks you're just as rotten as the rest of us. But he hates them the most because he feels like they're liars. But if you were to pull Nietzsche out and say, hey, dude, what's so bad about lying? I don't know. I just don't like it. For from within the Tao itself comes the only authority to modify the Tao. And so an open mind in questions that are not ultimate is useful. It's good for you to be open. But an open mind about the ultimate foundations, either of theoretical or of practical reason, is idiocy. If a man's mind is open on these things, let his mouth at least be shut. Okay, that's pretty cool. All right, Todd?
So, given all of this, would you say like the current societal trends of pushing boundaries and those things fall into people trying to modify the Tao? So, take your gay marriage as an example.
Yeah.
Or would you put it in the category of outside of the Tao?
I would put gay marriage as certainly people trying to modify the Tao. Like when you hear the entire LGBT movement, they are remarkably moral. They are not making dispassionate arguments about what science has proven or what logic demands. Nor are they trying to say, they're not trying to talk like Nietzsche, like the problem is morality itself. They're saying, if you don't support same-sex marriage, you're a bad person. If you don't support transgender identities, you're a bad person.
Because they love the other person.
Exactly. All right. So they're like that is them trying to use the Tao to wrongheadedly. But I was talking with Kevin about this actually just the other day. I think one of the reasons that our culture is backing away from a lot of LGBT stuff, especially transgenderism, support for transgenderism is really plummeting, is I think because transgenderism so flagrantly flaunts the Tao. It is such a viscerally heinous thing. When you see a man trying to dress like a woman, there's just something in you that's like, just kind of flinches at that. And transgenderism just rose so quickly into our cultural consciousness that we didn't have time to sear our conscience long enough to really accept that. And I think that's what's kind of led to some of the backlash against that. There are limits to the Tao. People can be off, but there's a truth, goodness, and beauty are not wax noses that can be bent forever. There's hard edges to this. And so you can push against it, and you can even try to use the arguments of the Tao. I mean, you've probably heard people try to use the Bible to defend things like this. But it still is there. It still stands. So I think most of what we are seeing today is operating within the Tao. I don't think we've moved beyond that yet. But that actually leads to what I'm going to end with, and that's what's opening to our last section. And I keep tantalizing you with this idea, I want to talk about artificial intelligence eventually with you. But this is going to be the ramp into the next chapter, which is where I hope to talk about it with you. So here's Lewis's concluding words in his second lecture. How can the modern mind be expected to embrace the conclusion we have reached? This Tao, which it seems we must treat as an absolute, is simply a phenomenon, like any other. The reflection upon the minds of our ancestors of the agricultural rhythm in which they lived, or even of their physiology. Many modern people explain, why do we find, Why are festivals so important? Or why do family matter so much to us today? Why do we feel this great care for our children? From the evolutionary psychology perspective, we say, well, in the past, our ancestors, this time of year was really important because that was harvest time. Or, if you didn't have a lot of children in your house, you couldn't work the field. And if you didn't work the field, you die. And so family groups and tribes which stuck closer together with strong bonds, evolution picked them to propagate. They were the ones who won the evolutionary race. And so those instincts were strengthened as the species progressed. And that's why today we now feel this powerful moral force to be together as a family. That's what he's saying. That's what all phenomenon can just kind of be like undressed like that. That's what people do often. It is the reflection of the mind of our ancestors who, the agricultural rhythms of their day. We know already, in principle, how such things, those moral values, those feelings, we already know how they're produced. Soon, we shall know in detail. Eventually, we shall be able to produce them at will. If we're saying over this course of, long periods of time, natural selection eventually gave us this certain set of moral feelings that we have, and we can kind of have a sense of why we have those as we look back on the hallway of time with our understanding of evolution. Well, he's saying eventually we'll get to where we know that even more clearly, and then eventually we'll get to where we'll be able to produce those feelings. Of course, so notice that Lewis right now is talking not in his own voice. He's talking about the way that someone would respond to his argument. If someone's following his argument this far and agrees with what he's saying about debunkers and innovators, here's what they could say in response. Of course, while we did not know how minds were made, we accepted this mental furniture as a datum, even as a master. But many things in nature which were once our masters have become our servants. Why not this? Meaning our minds, our sense of the Tao, our sense of moral furniture. Why must our conquest of nature stop short in stupid reverence before this final and toughest bit of nature, which has hitherto been called the conscience of man? You threaten us with some obscure disaster if we step outside the Tao, but we have been threatened that way by obscurantists at every step in our advance, and each time the threat has proved false. You say we shall have no values at all if we step outside the Tao. Very well. We shall probably find that we can get on quite comfortably without them. Let us regard all ideas of what we ought to do simply as an interesting psychological survival. Let us step right out of all that and start doing what we like. Let us decide for ourselves what man is to be and make him into that. Not on any ground of imagined value, but because we want him to be such. Having mastered our environment, let us now master ourselves and choose our own destiny. That's very possible. And those who hold it cannot be accused of self-contradiction, like the half-hearted skeptics, who still hope to find real values, like Gaius and Titius, when they've debunked the traditional ones. This is the rejection of the concept of value altogether. I shall need another lecture to consider it. And that leads into the last one. And this is the final painting of Thomas Cole's. This is called Death. And here is the old man. The tiller has been broken. The bow of the ship has been snapped off. But here he is in the serene, calm water on the other side of the punishing rocks. And the angel has once again returned to guide him back home, and another angel coming down from heaven to call him back up to his heavenly home. Who knows what happens after post-modernity, the world that we are in, the world that we are building. What we do know is we can't go back and pretend like science didn't happen, but we can retrieve the virtues of living before the face of God as he has made us and in this world. And maybe we are on a ship And maybe we know where lightning comes from, and we know why currents are the way they are, and the wind blows the way it does. But that does not mean that behind the winds and the current and the science that explains it, there is not a God who has created this world and has still set before us a way we ought to live. And that's what we want to do, and that's why we're studying this darn book. All right? All right. Let me pray. Father, we love you. We thank you for this day. Thank you for everything you've given us. Father, we pray that you would make us wise and discerning. Help us think clearly. Thank you for the thoughts of C.S. Lewis and his razor-sharp skill in being able to puncture false ideas. Make us sharp too, Father, and help us. Prepare our hearts as we go to church now. Lift us up to worship you, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.